Thanks very much for those questions. Let's start off on the more positive one about Syriza and how they've managed to build up that amount of vote. And I would say this, you've heard about the 17 general strikes that they had, although let's say that they went out on strike and it still wasn't enough to scare the Socialist Party who were elected from signing away all their rights and what many of them said their constitutional rights and their human rights. That wasn't enough. There were also the mass occupations of the squares. But from that, because I also met with a mayor up in the north of Athens and another mayor in the south of Athens, and they probably are the best two mayors in Athens, I'll admit that. But what they were doing is really working properly for their people. What came out of the Squares movement was some grassroots organisation into people's assemblies, and where the people said that they wanted to work in different specific areas in more detail on what they wanted. And from that sort of, not this just recent election, the election before, they were out together. There were even people who had normally been Tories before saying, look, politicians, what are you doing? We're all out here, the people are out here, we're all standing together, we're all demanding change, we're all saying we don't want these memorandum agreements. Why the hell can't you work together? Now I think that these people working together, it's more of them who have voted for Syriza. Now, but Syriza will have to obviously engage with them to build up a proper strong party membership. I think that will happen. And I think as austerity measures get worse, that more people will look to Syriza. They will look to Alexis Tsipras and think there's no one we can trust. Now on the more awkward issue of Brighton, some of you be aware, some of you read Red Pepper, I'm also co-convenor of the Green Left within the Green Party, that we challenged the Brighton councils to have a discussion to tell us what they were planning to do with their budget. Some of us, were a bit worried about them getting into power at that stage, not thinking, that they'll be elected in administration, but not really in power. There was nothing that they were going to be able to do on their own without agreement from somebody else. What they'd done in discussion with people and with trade unions was to get some agreement on raising a bit of council tax. We know that that can in the end be difficult because that does mean individuals paying more, but the very poorest are going to be left out of that. But of course when it came to it in the council chamber, there had been a pact really between the Tories and Labour to not allow that to go through. Unfortunately, I would say this, that we had a lot of very new councillors, not just new councillors, but new councillors in administration under a lot of pressure. And I don't think the thinking there was clear, I don't think it was right, and I don't think that they had taken the opportunity to come back to the party, to discuss it, and to get the support for taking a more dramatic stance, a proper stance. But I don't think that the way that they had built up their, if it had been me and another dozen Greens down there, the way that we would have built up our vote, the way that we would have canvassed on the doorstep, the issues we would have talked about, we would have been building up on an anti-austerity platform, and I'd have been out there at the public meetings with the Brighton Against the Cuts and fighting this government and encouraging more and more people in Brighton, empowering them to be part of that fight. I think they've made a mistake, and I think that part of that is due to some lack of experience, but they are being challenged. It's one small group within the party.
I want to take on the Syriza issue first, because I don't want the left to be divided again as to our attitude towards the left party in Greece. If you remember that only a few years ago they only got 5%, and the election the last few days they got between 27%. So that's, for me, is a massive increase, even though I'm disappointed that they haven't won. Don't forget when the Condemned government came into power in the United Kingdom, it blamed the Labour government for the deficit and went on, and then we because Labour wasn't pushing the other side of the argument, they came to dominate the politics in the United Kingdom. So it's not easy to make the argument, but the argument is now coming through as people are suffering, as people are losing their jobs, as our members, as we sit here as trade unionists, our members are under serious pressure in their workplace. So we're beginning to get the arguments through. And who knows, by the next election, Syriza will win and stop back and push back all that austerity. Now, on the second issue, I really can't agree with the Green Party member. It's either you support cuts or you're against. And I find it, and it's speeches like that I find difficult to deal with, because I'm finding it difficult as well because I'm the only Labour councillor, or the only councillor in a Labour-controlled council. It's easy to vote against cuts when you're in minority, but I'm the only councillor, even 3 years later, in a Labour-controlled council that's actually voting against cuts. And I say this, you vote against the cuts, you set a needs budget. That's what we need to advocate. You set a needs budget. Whether you're Labour or Green or whichever part of the left you're from, you set a needs budget. And let Pickles come in under Section 181 and remove you and set the budget himself. Because I know if Pickle comes into Brixton and set our budget, I will triple my majority in Vassal Ward and Brixton. I understand the pressures of the allowances that they receive these days, you know? A member of a cabinet can walk away with 50,000, the leader can walk away with £70,000 a year. When I first became a councillor in 1986, I got £150 a year after tax. A councillor in Merton at the time. And as you get elected now, first time elected to a council, you get 10,000 straight away before you even do a casework. A deputy cabinet member can carry you 20,000, a cabinet member 40,000. And let's be clear about this. And this is the thing that's in a way preventing, and it shouldn't prevent them, but I think, and I criticise them for using the allowances issue to prevent them from taking the right decisions, which is to defend their communities, oppose the cuts and oppose austerity.
Just on Reissmann, Tisperis himself has said he's under no illusions that it was a sudden shift to the left in a political sense. It was huge anger at, well, given the consequences, as I say, of a society which has been gradually dismantled. But it's a stunning surge of support from just 4.6% to nearly taking power. And they're now, Syriza, in a very strong position because we've got this coalition government getting together with the remnants of PASOK, the so-called Socialist Party, who only got 12%. They're now looking likely to split as that government imposes measures which are just completely politically impossible. This country is already now in the midst of a depression worse than the US Great Depression. GDP, debt to GDP ratio is soaring at the moment as these austerity measures bite, so it's failing on their own measure. I don't see how it can last. That's what the leader Syriza said himself. They'll be the voice of the streets in a strong position. But we should be clear about why they got to this position, why other parties and the rest of the anti-austerity movement look set to gain. This is an attempt, what we've seen in the past few years, to use a crisis of the market to push policies that otherwise would not be politically possible. Rahm Emanuel was chief of staff for Barack Obama until a few years ago, and in 2008, as the financial crisis began, he said, you never want a crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, he said, is it gives you a chance to introduce policies that are otherwise not politically possible. That sums up the whole approach of this government and governments right across Europe. They have turned that crisis, what should have been the death knell of neoliberal capitalism, into its greatest opportunity yet. And I went to Portugal back in November. I was there during the general strike which took place in November. And again, I spoke actually, I'm a journalist hat on, to economists and business people who supported the measures that were taking place, and they were open and candid. They said, we support these policies, always support these policies, which is mass privatisation, slashing taxes on the rich, attacking workers' rights, but they said it wasn't possible in normal circumstances. It needed a crisis like this to do what they said were politically necessary reforms. So we've always got to remember that this is an attempt to transform European societies, not just here, into even more so it's shaped in the interest of the people at the top. And just lastly, just on that last point, look, I understand the feelings, rightly strong, how strong our anger is. Communities across the country getting pummeled by cuts. And Kingsley, what you did, you're an inspiration and courageous in every sense, and I think everyone in the room thinks that. But let's make sure, whatever happens, we stay united. We don't let tactical differences divide us to the extent where we end up squabbling amongst ourselves rather than focusing on the real enemy. We take these, we debate them within our movement, and we debate them passionately, but we always remember who the real enemies are, and it is not, and I speak as someone of the Labour left, it is not the Green Party. Thank you.
I'm afraid I struggle to see implementing cuts as a tactical difference. I really struggle to see that. Okay. I do think that there is a matter of principle that if I'm being picked on, I've spent all my life.
You don't need a mic carrying shout.
No, I probably don't.
Pretend they're apprentices.
Use the other one, yeah. John, use the other one.
I'll give you the other one, yeah.
Switch that off.
You see, I think there's a... My one's not on there. I'll stand up and then you can hear me. I do think it is not a matter of a tactical difference as to whether or not you implement cuts in the current sort of climate. I do think it is an essential principle that we need to be saying yes or no to. And I think you have to applaud somebody like Kingsley, who in incredibly difficult circumstances has loyally stood by the principle and been a beacon of hope. And actually the Greens in Brighton had an opportunity to be a council that was a beacon of hope, that refused to implement cuts, that stood up against them and said this is not what we're doing. And if we get into debt, if you can bail out the Royal Bank of Scotland, if you can bail out Northern Rock, if you can bail out the billionaires, then you can come and bail out Brighton Council as well. And what message would that have given? And I think we have to have those arguments and those debates, but it isn't something that we can say and then we can agree to disagree. We have to fight for that, because every bit of time Syriza gets 27% of the vote, anybody who stands on an austerity package that reflects that movement of anti-austerity, that helps people who are fighting struggle on the ground. Every time people struggle on the ground, it helps to move people to the left in terms of an election. There is a relationship between the two, and I think if you get elected and then you abstain, or you do worse and you implement cuts, then I think you betray the people who voted you in there, and I congratulate
the next question is from Moss Greenshields. I did mean to say, and I keep meaning to say, George Galloway isn't coming over. I'm not hiding him out the back for him to surprise us in a minute. He texted just before the meeting was about to start to give his greetings to the meeting, but something's come up in London, so unfortunately he can't be here.
He's done on leave.
He's sorting his cat out.
Okay, that's sad news. I'm about to introduce a question. So the question is, how can we help turn the economic crisis into a political crisis for this government?
Thanks, Alison.
Well, first, let's be clear, this government has absolutely no mandate whatsoever for what he's doing. I remember actually the last time the Tories won a general election. I remember it just about because I was 7 years old. It was 1992, and I remember it because my teachers came dressed in black. And the fact is, the last election was handed to them on a plate, in theory, a woefully unpopular Labour government, and one of the worst economic crises in a century, and they still only got 36% of the vote and failed to win a majority. It is the worst showing of any Tory government in modern history. They don't have a mandate for what they're doing. And we've got to, in a sense, learn from them, because what they did is, as I say, they turned a crisis of the market and they turned it into a crisis of public spending, and since then have used it as an opportunity to attack rights which our movement has fought for with huge sacrifices for decades. Now the problem is they've got a bit of a head start on us because they've got the support of the entire ruling class and the mainstream media. But we have to start turning this crisis to our own advantage. And the fact is, things are already changing. Class, as I say, this think tank I'm working for, we did a poll. And what we did is we put a lot of the policies which have been introduced or supported by Francois Hollande in France, we tested their support. We got UUL to test their support. We tested, for example, would you support 75% tax on those earning £1 million or more, as Francois Hollande has promised to introduce? Nearly 60% of the population backed that, including more than 4 out of 10 Conservative voters. If you want a mainstream, centre-ground policy, then there it is. We asked, in terms of a mass house building programme, including a council house building programme, a massive, again, I think it was more than 6 out of 10 backed it. We asked in terms of using the bailed out banks. Well, let's not forget, New Labour nationalised the debts and privatised the profits, using our the bailed out banks to actually have publicly controlled bank which would invest in our economy. Again, there was overwhelming support. The tide has shifted, and I think if we start linking together our struggles and we start developing a coherent alternative, we are up against a government which doesn't have a mandate for what it's doing. It is far weaker than Thatcher. The difference is as well, Thatcher tried to pick off her opponents one by one. This government's playing in the politics of shock and awe. It's attacking us from every single side, every single front, from the privatisation of the NHS, which they didn't have the guts to put to the electorate because they know they would have been massacred if they'd have done so. Whether it be that, tax on benefits, whether it be the biggest cuts overall since the 1920s. They've bitten off more than they can chew. On every measure, whether it be jobs, growth, borrowing, they've failed. In fact, just to quickly remind people, I don't know if people remember, in the last election, Labour mocked up this poster of David Cameron as that bloke from Life on Mars. What's his name? Does anyone remember the character? Yeah, that's the one. And he's perching smugly on an Audi Quattro. And he said, don't let him bring us back to the 1980s. Well, how wrong Labour were. Because this is a far worse recession than the 1980s. It is worse than the last double-dip recession of the 1970s. It is a more protracted economic crisis than the 1930s. You have to go back to the so-called Long Depression. You have to dust off your history books to look this up, which began in the 1870s. Don't let him bring us back to the 1870s would have been a more apt slogan, but I'm not that familiar with mid-Victorian fiction, so I don't know who he'd have been mocked up as. But the fact is, on every single level, whether it be a measure, whether it be growth, borrowing, jobs, they have catastrophically failed. And the only challenge we have is turning people's resignation, because that's our biggest enemy at the moment, it's people feeling resigned, a lack of hope that there is an alternative. That's what we have to fight. If we develop our coherent alternative and organise around it, tap into people's anger, then we can take on a government which, as I say, has no mandate for what it's doing.
Well, if there's no mandate for the calm-down government here in England, there's even less of a mandate for them in Wales. And we know that from the 1980s, it was Thatcher, it was John Redwood, it was Secretaries of States for Wales being imposed on Wales, who didn't even represent seats within Wales, that actually created the scene for a successful devolution vote in 1997. So, for me, there's hope that this crisis will enable people in Wales and in Scotland too to wake up and realise that they'd be much better off by taking control of their own destiny than hoping to rely on any kind of good deal from a Conservative government in London. And for us as well, there's always the question of who's going to rule from London against our interests. Because the election, the UK general election, is decided on a handful of key marginal seats in Middle England, and the whole debate doesn't reflect the reality of life then in Wales. Before I finish, I just want to agree with what Owen said at the end of his contribution there. I think our biggest danger in all of this is apathy. So many people have just switched off and given up, and don't believe that anything that they can do can change things. They don't believe that their vote can make a difference, and they don't believe that getting involved in anything
can make a difference. And that is, I think, our biggest enemy and our biggest challenge to change. How can we enthuse people to get involved in the political process? That's a really difficult question, I think, that all of us need to think about.
Sorry, I honestly haven't fallen asleep there at all. I want to come back in on what Owen talked about building a movement, and go back to something that Romayne said earlier, because the whole idea of building and having a movement within Britain is something that the TUC discussed in 2009 when they adopted the People's Charter, which is supported and endorsed both by the Scottish TUC and the Wales TUC regionally. It has 6 key principles that are about investing in Britain, investing in our economy, and we've been discussing today council housing, benefits, all those issues were addressed within the People's Charter. So I think we've got to learn to stop reinventing the wheel. We've got tools within our movement that we should be using in trying to build that movement. And as I'm looking around, I don't want to lose the moment. As I'm looking around, I can see people are thinking, well, what is the People's Charter? So if after you've finished at this meeting, you want to know a bit more about it, you can come and join me at the Beacon Hotel at 7:45.
Thanks, Mons. Okay, I think we'll move on.